The first time the page moved, Eli thought it was the draft. There wasn't a draft. His dorm windows were shut, the radiator ticking lazily like a hot plate cooling. It was 1:13 a.m., far too late to be reading anything that smelled like basement and mildew. But that was the kind of night it had become. He'd found the notebook an hour earlier, tucked behind a row of forgotten theses in the library's sublevel, a cloth-bound relic with no title, just deep, oily scuffs where hands had carried it for too many years. On the front, in stamped gold barely visible, a single initial, A. Eli had opened it out of boredom. He kept reading out of unease. Words crowded the yellowed paper, a slanted hand that grew tighter as it went, like the writer had been writing while walking. No, while running. Names, dates, towns you could triangulate on a map if you wanted to bring trouble to your front door. Stories that weren't stories at all, destinations disguised as warnings. He turned a page, and the notebook turned one back all by itself. Eli froze. The page he was reading shifted enough to catch the lamplight, its edges whispering against the next sheet as if something beneath had exhaled. "That's fine," he said to no one. And because saying anything felt better than silence, he added, "Static cling." He pressed his palm to the paper until the oil from his skin left a darker square. When he lifted his hand, the page lifted too, just enough to show him a sentence he hadn't gotten to yet, centered like a title. "If you are reading this at night, you are not alone." The radiator clicked. The halls were dead quiet. Eli glanced at the closed door, at the little rolled towel he kept jammed against the crack to keep pot smoke from drifting under. And when he looked back, the next page had turned entirely on its own. He watched the blank backside dip and settle like a chest taking a breath, and decided, with a humorless smile that felt borrowed from an older version of himself, that at least he wasn't bored anymore. He leaned closer. The ink on the new page looked darker, fresher. The header read in that slanted, urgent hand, "The Vanishing Hitchhiker." The radiator gave up and went cold. Eli swallowed, because there was the faintest sound in the room now, impossible and close. The soft, dry rhythm of a pencil moving just beneath the linen of the page, like the words were still being written while he watched. No one had sent him to the sublevel. Eli had wandered there because the main stacks were full of finals week ghosts, slack jaws and hoodies and the wet cough of the coffee machine. He'd meant to skim some notes for a midterm and instead found the elevator with the scratched panel and the bottommost button that stuck when you pressed it. The sublevel smelled like old paper and coins. He liked it immediately. He'd traced his finger along the spines of the things down there, and the virgin dust that came away was an accusation. The notebook had been hidden behind a run of sociology volumes on folklore, urban myths, and mass panics, shelved wrong as if someone had tucked it there for a second and then never came back. In his room, Eli set it on his desk between his lamp and the photo strip of him and his roommate, Jay, at a campus fair, tongues blue from cotton candy. Jay was at his girlfriend's apartment that night, and his absence made the room feel like a stage, all its props waiting for someone to start the scene. Eli had flipped to the first page. A date, a town, a name. The story that followed was clinical at first, spare. But details bloomed at the edges. The writer was either a collector of testimonies or a very good liar. There were phone numbers sometimes, post office boxes, police incident numbers, always 3 or 4 digits off as if the writer was daring you to try. His lamp was the good kind, soft shade, warm bulb. It made a circle of light on the desk like a ring of salt. Outside that circle, all the corners of the room had retreated. Eli leaned in, already caught by the voice. He read the title again. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. He let the pages hold him the way stories always had, and he didn't notice when his own room began to echo around the words. They said it happened on the state road that runs out past the quarry, the one whose mile markers disappear for 3 counts between the 8 and the 12. They said if you drive it after midnight in the rain, you'll see her, barefoot, hair plastered to her cheeks, white dress the color of headlights. They said she never raises her thumb because you'll stop anyway. Nate wasn't from here. He was 22 and had a truck he talked about like a dog he owned. He fed it grease and it never bit. He worked late, the kind of shifts that leave a grit at the corners of your eyes. When he took the back road that night, the radio was low and the windows fogged around the edges in a way that made the world feel smaller and safer. She stepped into his high beams as if she were stepping on stage. He braked so hard that the empty fast food bag on his passenger floor crinkled itself into a ball. She stood looking at the truck like she'd forgotten what vehicles were for. Her hair dripping, her dress wrung out. Nate rolled his window down with a squeal that sounded loud in the rain. "You okay?" he asked. She blinked, the slow blink of someone coaxing herself back into her body. Then she nodded. When she spoke, the sound was thin, like something pulled taut and plucked. "Can you take me home?" It was so absurdly ordinary that Nate laughed, a surprised burst that fogged the inside of his windshield. "Yeah, sure. Hop in." She didn't open the door. She walked around the hood and stood beside the passenger window, and Nate, feeling foolish, leaned across to unlatch it. The door opened as if someone had opened it from the outside, and then she was slipping into the seat beside him, smelling like wet cotton and something colder, like the air before a hailstorm. "Seatbelt," Nate said, because even to a ghost, you say seatbelt. She touched the belt lightly and then put her hands in her lap, folding one over the other. "It's the house on 37th, she said, "with the iron fence." "It's not far." The windshield wipers made their metronome. The heater huffed. The radio said nothing. The road ran out ahead, unspooling like tape. Nate drove. He talked the way you talk when you're the only warm thing in a cold place. "Rough night?" No answer. "You from around here?" No answer. "Okay," Nate said, and laughed again, softer. "That's okay. Yeah, I'll just drive." 37th was 5 turns away. He took them. The rain softened once they were in the grid of houses, rain becoming mist like the town exhaled. The place she'd described was there, iron fence cut in parlor scrolls, a porch that made promises about summers. Nate pulled to the curb, felt the small bump of the tire against it. He put the truck in park, turned to say something. "You got a key?" And the passenger seat was empty. Nate's mouth stayed open a second too long. He closed it. He opened it again, because this was the part where he laughed and said, "Okay," and then he'd find the explanation. The obvious door he'd missed. He leaned down and peered at the floor, as if she had become shoes. He wiped his hand through the air above the seat like he might feel the heat of her. "Hey," he said, to the glove compartment, to the rain. "Okay." There was a porch light on at the iron-fenced house. He could see shadows moving through curtains, that tame domestic ballet that says someone is washing dishes and someone else is drying. He sat with his hands on the wheel for 3 breaths, then opened his door and went up the walk with wet shoulders. An elderly man answered. He had the kind of eyes that look surprised even when they aren't. The house smelled like onions and soap. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Nate said and stopped. The story was stupid when you had to say it. "I gave a girl a ride. She said this was her house." The man didn't even blink at the stupid. He looked past Nate at the truck, then at the world like he was measuring it against one he'd known. "Can you tell me what she looked like?" Nate did. He described the hair and the dress and the thin, taut voice. The man pressed his lips together. "Would you come in?" he said gently. "For just a minute." The living room was the color of sweet tea. There were photographs on the mantel, all the faces peering out with the particular simple certainty of people who expect to see you again. The man took a frame in a practiced way, like there were nights he took it down just to hold it, and passed it to Nate. "Her name was Caroline," he said. The photo was of a girl standing beneath a tree that was trying very hard to be a tree, too young to know yet that it was just a place where birds would leave their bones. She had on a white dress and a hair ribbon. Her smile was honest. You could hear summer in the picture. "She died in an accident near the quarry," the man said. 6 years ago. The radiator in the living room shuddered to life, a small storm of heat. Somewhere in the kitchen, a spoon knocked against a pot. The man's voice had the worn softness of something he'd said too many times. "She comes home when it rains," he said. Nate left the house with his head bowed against the mist and drove away with the radio off. He did not look at the passenger seat again. He didn't see the two pale crescent shapes in the fogged window, the places where someone's fingers had rested, as if to steady herself when the truck took the turn onto 37th. Back in his dorm room, Eli turned the page and found water beading where his finger had been, round perfect spheres like the paper itself had learned to sweat. He swiped at it. His fingertips came away damp. He stood and checked the windows even though he knew they were shut. The radiator had gone cold at the story's start, and now, when he stood over it, forced a low breath like the sigh of a tired animal and started to tick again. He put a hand on the dorm door. It was cool and dry. His lamp flickered just once, the bulb straining at the end of its patience. When the light steadied, there were wet footprints on the cheap carpet. 2, placed neatly in front of the desk as if a barefoot girl had stood a long moment watching him read. Eli's pulse brought itself into his throat. He leaned down, and they were gone. The carpet was just carpet again, gray and thin and clean enough. The notebook waited with the patience of old things. The next legend's title was already peeking from the bottom of the right-hand page as if it had been shoved into place from below. He sat. He pulled the chair closer. He read, "The Man in the Walls." They say you get used to the noises your house makes. The old pipes have conversations. The floorboards complain and then keep secrets. At 3 a.m., as a house shifts from one dream to the next, everything speaks a little, and you learn how to tell the names of the voices. But this was a voice the house didn't have. It started with missing eggs, then the cheese, little embarrassments you wouldn't admit to anyone unless you couched them in humor. Guess who forgot he used the last of the butter? May and Elliot were new in the place, a narrow 2-story with a roof that slouched in a friendly way and windows that stuck if you weren't sweet to them. They were saving for something bigger. They had a baby monitor on the bedside table even when the baby was napping downstairs and there was no one in the house but them. "Did you drink the last of the milk?" May asked one morning, performing cheerfulness as she shook an empty carton that chimed with 2 invisible drops. "I poured it on the floor," Elliot said, "to keep the ants at bay." They laughed. They did not look at the ceiling. The first night they heard footsteps, Elliot went up there with a flashlight and a bat that still had price sticker across the handle. The attic was a warm place that smelled like insulation and rain. He found nothing up there but the footprint of his own fear where he'd set it down and almost forgotten it. They blamed the raccoons. Then, an opossum. Elliot said, "This is an opossum house," and May said, "We are not making that cute." But it wasn't an animal that put the baby's blanket back in the wrong crib. It wasn't an opossum that turned their family photos face down on the dresser the same day the eggs went missing. Again. One night the monitor woke them with the small, careful sound it makes when someone is moving inside its radius. Elliot reached for it, fumbled, put the speaker to his ear. The sound was breathing. Not soft baby breaths, those little blows on a bottle, but long measured ones like someone counting in the dark. Elliot moved. He was up. The hallway was cool on his feet. The nursery door was half closed, a still life of wood and light. He pushed it open with the back of his hand like a cop because he had watched too much television. The crib was empty. No, not empty. The blanket had been folded into a neat square and put on the floor beside it, like the baby had made his own bed and stepped out for a smoke. "May," Elliot said, a body-sized whisper, and then louder, because there are moments when you decide to throw your voice against the world. "May!" She came behind him, and then she didn't. She stopped in the doorway because you only get to be 30 once, and she hadn't planned to turn 30 in a world where a crib is a stage with no actor. They found their son against the wall. Not in the vague way where a child is close to a wall and so you say against. The crib had been moved, silent and perfect, 3 feet to the right, and behind it the drywall was disturbed. The painted surface creased down to a hairline crack, like something on the other side had pressed while they slept. Their son was laid out at the baseboard on a pillow none of them owned, a small one with a crocheted cover. And he was sleeping. May picked him up as if whatever had placed him there might take offense at being rushed. There are times for calling the police and times when the only person you can call is yourself. Elliot pulled the crib into the center of the room and May put the baby back inside with a slow, ritual care. Her hands sang, "I can perform control, and perhaps the world will follow." "Tomorrow," Elliot said softly, "we're moving." In the morning, the kitchen cabinet was open, the one with the cereal and the crackers, and a man's handprint was grayed into the dust on the shelf. Not a big hand, not a small one, neither. The slanted kind of hand that belongs to someone with a slanted life. They left that day. They hadn't saved up enough. It didn't matter. They packed furiously and then painfully slow because every object had to be judged according to whether it had been left alone. They paid 2 months' rent because it felt like bribing a god to turn away. On their last trip to the curb, Elliot's bat fell sideways and rolled to a stop against the vent in the hall. The vent wasn't screwed on. He saw that because the bat had nudged it and it had moved just enough to show a darkness behind. He crouched, knees popping, and lifted the vent. The smell was a wet pocket. He reached his hand in, very gently, and touched the most ordinary and terrifying thing. The pillowcase with something soft inside. He pulled it out and it spilled itself onto the floor. Photographs, 20 of them, printed with the slanting color of cheap ink. All pictures of their kitchen table. All pictures taken from inside the wall through the vent. In every one, May and Elliot were eating or laughing or not looking at the thing watching them. The last photo was a little blurred because the photographer had been shaking. It showed May holding their son, his head slumped against her shoulder and her mouth was half open, either in song or in the beginning of a scream. Elliot put the photos back in the pillowcase and put the pillowcase back in the vent and slid the cover over, and did not tell May because in some universes you make people safer with the things you keep from them. He left the bat where it was, leaned up against the wall like a man standing perfectly still inside. They checked into a motel by the highway whose carpet smelled like the people who had stood on it, and then kept going. They were asleep before 9. At 3:07 a.m., A desk clerk in a blue vest went to empty the ice bin and looked up by accident. The motel had vents too. He saw something there, a small movement in the dark that might have been a mouse or an ordinary shadow. And he shrugged and went back to work because it is healthy sometimes not to name what you see. Eli smoothed his palm over the page as if perhaps the smoothness of his palm could make the story quiet down. But the notebook was a kind of instrument, and touching the paper only made it louder. The radiator ticked. The lamp hummed. From the ceiling above his bed came the faintest shuffle, a sound that could have been the building settling or a man in the ductwork rearranging his pillow. Eli stared up, throat tight. He told himself the ventilation was sealed. He told himself no one could get in without the RA seeing. He told himself that people do not live in walls anymore. Then, the overhead light fixture, frosted glass and flies, gave a gentle, domestic cluck, the sound a person makes when asking a baby for his attention. "Jay," Eli said to the ceiling, and immediately felt stupid. Silence. The longer kind. He turned the page. The next story had no title at the top. It began with a description of tires on gravel and a clock blinking 2:11 in blue digits on a dashboard. Only in the third paragraph did the words announce themselves, smooth and heavy as stones. The black-eyed children. The gas station off exit 19 was one of those places that was always almost closed. The lights were on but dim, the fountain machine listing like a ship around one missing lever, the coffee hot but tasting like the memory of coffee. It was late enough that the bugs had given up on the glass and were sleeping in their own bodies. Derek and Lena sat in their car with the engine running. They had been at a hospital for 13 hours. The clock on the dash told a joke about time. The radio whispered to itself so it wouldn't wake the night. They held hands without either of them noticing when they'd reached across the console to take the other. That was when the knocking started. It was gentle, polite. It came from the back passenger door. They both turned at the same time because they had spent enough hours doing things at the same time that it had become part of the way they lived. Two figures stood there, still and very small, silhouettes against the light spill from the gas station. A boy and a girl in hooded sweatshirts, zipped to tidy throats. Derek rolled his window down an inch. "Can I help you?" he asked, and the polite phrasing felt right because the knocking had been polite, and because it was easier to talk as if this were normal and the normal would obey. "Our phone died," the boy said. He was 8 or 9. His voice was careful. "Can we get a ride home?" The girl beside him lifted her chin. She hadn't made a sound yet. Her hood was up even though the air wasn't cold. "We live close," the boy said. "It's not far." The dashboard clock made the blue 2:11 hum. Lena rolled her window down too, just a little, because there was a part of her that recognized something that should be sweet. Small people asking for help. She had been in rooms all day where small people asked for help in voices too thin and fierce to be ignored. "What's your address?" she asked. The boy lifted a hand, palm up, like a magician displaying that he was empty. The gesture was so odd that it snagged her attention and held it. "If you let us in," he said, "we can tell you." "We'll drive behind you," Derek said. "You can lead us and—" "That won't work," the boy said. He smiled finally. It was a small smile of accomplishment, like he'd remembered the right line. "We need to be inside first." Something prickled in Lena's arms and legs, the kind of prickling that is ancient and refuses to be educated away, the good and learned human impulse to help, rubbing hard against an older animal impulse that saw 2 cubs on the path and smelled the brush moving. The gas station door scraped open. A night clerk stepped out with a broom like a staff. He saw the car and the children, and he stood and watched as if watching were the most normal thing he could do. "Where are your parents?" Derek asked, which was a line that adults say even when the children are alone, because hearing the word parents makes the ground steady again. "Inside," the girl said suddenly, her voice flat with a kind of raw fatigue. "We can't go in without you." "We're not allowed," the boy added, as if correcting her, then smiled again, earnestly this time, like he was trying to be good at smiling. "Please let us in." "We need to come in." They were close enough now that the light from the gas station finally found their faces. The eyes were the wrong thing. Not just wrong like a color wrong, but wrong like a category mistake. The sockets were filled with simple black, not as if the pupils had gone wide, but as if the holes had been painted. It wasn't glossy. It was a swallow, but taking in. A universe minus its stars. Lena didn't scream because she was too tired to scream. She made a sound with no vowel in it, a letter you only pronounce in emergencies. Derek's hand tightened on hers. The boy put his palm on the glass. "Please," he whispered, and the plea broke on something like hunger. "It's so cold." "We can't come in unless you say." They left then, because departure is a kind of consent the body grants itself when the mind won't. Derek threw the car in to drive. Lena said, "I'm sorry," out loud to the children, and also to any god that was listening. And then the wheels were rolling and the gas station was thinning in the rear view like a snow globe you shake, and the clerk, holding his broom like a sword he'd inherited and never learned to use, watched them go. 2 minutes down the road they both looked in the rear view at once, which is how you see together with someone long enough. In the mirror the children were closer. Not in the way things appear closer in a mirror. Closer like the car had picked them up without opening a door. Lena licked her lips without knowing she had done it and tasted copper. She rubbed at the mirror with her sleeve, small domestic gesture. And when she looked again, the black eyes were nearer. No faces now, only the eyes, pressed politely against the glass. "Don't look," Derek said. But he had looked and couldn't stop. His foot found the accelerator as if there were only two kinds of people left in the world. The ones who stop to let strangers in, and the ones who run. They didn't talk about it later. Not when they pulled into their apartment's parking garage and sat breathing the same air in the parked car with the engine ticking its slow, cooling tick. They didn't mention that the elevator mirror showed a crowded box, 4 people standing shoulder to shoulder in the dim. They didn't mention that their bathroom mirror did not show them brushing their teeth, that instead it showed the empty doorway behind them and the patient, polite black inside the hall. They went to bed with the lights on. In the morning, they were themselves again, or close enough to pass. The night clerk at exit 19 told the story to a trucker at dawn, and the trucker took a sip of his coffee and nodded, like a man who had driven through 1 or 2 different hells already and could make room for a third. Eli lived with his mirror, with his lamp, with his ceiling. He had slept under that ceiling 19 times and never once asked whether there were hands pressed to the other side. Now he didn't look at the mirror at all. He wiped the steam away with his towel and did not check whether his own face had brought anyone with it. The next page in the notebook was thinner than the rest, a different stock, slicker, as if for this one the writer had used whatever paper he could grab. The ink bled there and made lobed shapes like leaves. It began with a dare and 3 names and a time. The midnight game. Rules make you brave. That's what rules are for. To give your fear a fence it can run alongside without getting lost. The game had been in a forum that everyone swore they didn't read. It was an old ritual with a new coat of pixels. You summoned something called the Midnight Man. You apologized to it with your whole body while pretending you were in charge. You wrote your name on paper and pricked your finger and made yourself a gift. You needed a candle, matches, salt, a piece of paper with your full name, a pin, a wooden door. If you didn't have the door, you made one. If you didn't have salt, you lied to yourself and used sugar, and then wrote your regret in thin white lines on the back of your throat. Dara and Miguel and Chloe did it because the night was long, and their campus was small, and nobody had texted back. They met in a hallway with doors that had been painted the color of pickles and a floor that made their sneakers squeal. Dara had the candle. Miguel had the lighter. Chloe had the salt in a sandwich bag she'd taken from the dining hall as if she were smuggling something precious from a country at war. "Okay," Chloe said, and then said it again because the word's first job was to make the air feel like it belonged to them. "Okay, we're not idiots." "Speak for yourself," Miguel said, but he was scanning the rules on his phone even as he joked. They placed their papers in front of a door. They pricked their fingers and made small red suns on the paper's center line. They knocked on the door 22 times, with the last knock coming at midnight exactly. Because rules are best when they involve numbers you can keep like beads. Then they blew out the candle and opened the door, and let a piece of the night outside into the night inside. They stepped back, all three of them, with their candles relit and their shoulders touching like they had learned from fire drills. "Now what?" Miguel whispered. "We walk," Dara whispered back. "We don't let the candle go out. If it goes out, we relight it within 10 seconds. If we can't, we make the salt circle and we wait until 3:33. We don't look behind us. We apologize if we feel breath on our necks." "That's a lot of instructions," Miguel said to the candle, and the candle, being a candle, didn't mind. They walked. The hall stretched. It had been 24 doors long when they were sober and bored and counting RA bulletin boards. Now it was longer. The exit sign at the far end got farther when they made a turn. A draft breathed along the baseboards and the three candles bent their flames in agreement. Chloe's candle went out first. She swore in a thin, bright voice, a voice that belonged to someone who had practiced sounding brave in a small panic. She fumbled with her lighter and missed and recovered and lit nothing but the smell of fuel. Miguel bent his candle to hers, and they made a small shared sun and blew on it in that anxious way of people learning to keep something alive. 8 seconds, Dara said, because timekeeping is a love language. 9. The candle took and held. Chloe exhaled hard enough to make the flame bow low. They walked. Miguel's candle went out next. It was a quick, petty thing, as if a small mouth had puckered and said, "Now." He relit it quickly, refusing to tremble, because if the devil can smell fear, then small devils can drink it. They turned a corner and walked a hall that had not been there an hour ago, where the paint was new but not dry, and their shoulders tattooed themselves against it when the path narrowed. Someone had written a word there with the flat of a hand. It had been smeared later into nonsense. Dara's candle went out last. She had been careful, as if carefulness were something you could spend and never run out. The air around her face felt slightly cooler. A breath moved the hair behind her ear like a lover checking for a reaction. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt right, and she didn't ask who to. Her lighter chose that moment to fail in a domestic way, a way you could curse at. She flicked it, and in the weak light she could see her own fingers, smudged with salt, smudged with the red of earlier, smudged with the gray of touching the wall where it had been painted wet. 10, Chloe whispered, apology in her voice too. "Dara, 10. They moved like people building a tent in high wind. The salt poured beautifully. It made a circle that was exactly as big as 3 bodies and a fear. They stepped in and touched shoulders and put their candle stubs in a small cluster in the center of the circle like a bouquet. Something touched the circle then, very softly, in the way a cat investigates a boundary. The salt shivered. It drew inward in a way that salt doesn't. "Okay," Miguel said, and then, because he had said okay before and survived it, he said it again, more stubborn now. "Okay." They dozed in a pulse, one awake, 2 sleeping, then waking into the velvety hour when the air is thick with whatever you haven't said yet. At 3:31, they thought perhaps they had imagined the game. At 3:32, the hallway breathed in. At 3:33, the lights snapped on with an angry hum, and they were 3 sophomores clutching candles that had burned down to coins. In the morning, Chloe had a gray fingerprint in the brightness behind her ear. Miguel tasted ash when he drank his coffee and found a single grain of salt embedded in his tongue. Dara washed her hands, and the water beaded on them as if her skin had learned to refuse. The door they had used was stubborn for a week. It became one of those doors that needs to be coaxed like a horse. The game, like all games, ended and required them to pretend it had never really begun. Eli had not played the midnight game. His circle of salt was the circle of light on his desk, the lamp like a little saint. He leaned closer to the notebook as if this would make his body too big to fit in the vents. The air in the room tasted tubed and borrowed. He put his fingers on the edge of the page and the paper lifted under them, eager, like a dog at the end of a leash that knows the park is next. The title on the following page had been written so carefully the letters looked like they had been carved. Eli felt something settle in his stomach in the way conclusive sentences do. The Smiling Man. Some streets have a memory of footsteps. At night they play them back. You can hear laughter echoing even when no one ever laughed there. You can hear the scrape of a heel where someone ran once and then pretended they hadn't. Jonas worked late at the bookstore and walked home because bus routes vanish when you really need them. The night was a mild wait, the kind of night that made you think about the word temperate and how it sounds like a weather witch you would trust. He turned onto a longer, emptier block and he saw him. At first, the man looked like one of those electrical boxes that cities dress up with decals so they don't look like electrical boxes. He was tall to the point of wrongness, his proportions arguing amongst themselves about how a body is meant to be assembled. He wore what might have been a suit if the suit had been described to someone in a dream and then tailored by a person who had never met a human. His tie was wrong not because of the pattern, but because the rules of ties didn't seem to apply to it. He was smiling. It wasn't a grin. It wasn't wide enough to have teeth politics. It was a smile like someone had drawn it on in careful pen, a child's rendering of pleasantness. His mouth was so still. Jonas had never realized how alive a mouth usually is, the way it twitches, the way it swallows. The stillness of the smile made Jonas's own mouth errand-like. He swallowed twice, as if to demonstrate movement. The man was under a streetlight, and then he wasn't. He didn't walk out of it so much as exist under the next one. The light hummed, the way streetlights hum when they're sure of their authority. Jonas kept walking because the night respects people who move like they know where they're going. He thought about calling someone, anyone, and didn't, because holding your phone in your hand marks he was prey in only 2 universes, and both of them are our own. The smiling man did not walk. He jittered. He moved with a little stutter step like a record skipping. No, like the idea of a person being flipped through in a deck. Closer, farther, closer. Jonas knew then and could not unknow. The man's smile was for him. It was personalized. It had his name written under it in an alphabet the air only uses for proper nouns. He crossed the street. The smiling man didn't. He stood under one lamp and then under another one across the way that Jonas hadn't seen him walk to. Jonas's body chemistry learned a new language in which the word for run and the word for die are homonyms. "Hey," Jonas said brightly, because people joke before they scream. "I'm not into street surveys." He made his hand into a shape that claimed he'd been interrupted while doing something ordinary. The smiling man's head tilted. It was not coy, it was curious, like a dog learning a new trick, like a god learning a new worshiper. "Hey," Jonas said again, softer, and then it happened. The man's smile sharpened by 1 degree. It was nothing. It was the difference between the number 1 and the number 2. It was everything. Jonas ran. He ran like he was 14 and late, and the dark had a mouth and his mother could make porch lights banish anything. He ran, and his body sang in the way bodies do when they're allowed to be what they are. He could hear footsteps behind him that did not belong to a man with legs. They belonged to a violin being tuned between 2 realities. He reached his building. He keyed himself in with hands he did not recognize. He took the stairs because elevators cannot be trusted with momentum, and because if you die in an elevator, you die in an anecdote. He reached his door and got it open and slammed it and put his back to it and slid down it, his breath breaking at the corners like a tide. Silence came. It wasn't relief. It was an enormous pause, a creature holding its breath. He laughed once, a bark that smelled like adrenaline. Then there was the noise. It was a sound like someone sweeping, like a broom strained across concrete. Jonas's front hall had a rug he'd been planning to replace. The rasp sounded as if the thing at the other side of the door was dragging its feet, or dragging something that it had borrowed from the other side. The knob turned. It was one of those small, ceremonious turns that knobs make when a human hand is on them. Then it rotated back the same slow degree, as if the hand had changed its mind or was learning about purposes. Jonas went still. He was a small animal in a larger animal's mouth, pretending to be a tooth. When the knock came, a single, polite knock, something inside him answered with its hands open. He rose. He put his own hand on the knob. He stood there the way men in plays stand, 2 doors away from a plot. He leaned in, and because fear and tenderness are siblings, he said softly, "Please go." What he heard was laughter, but not in the mean sense. It was laughter like someone had read a line slightly wrong and then was happy to discover the better version. It was very close. He could smell something then, something like static and rain, the ozone that lives in photographs of summer storms. He stepped back. The knock didn't come again. He waited 3 breaths, and then 4 more, and then 9. When he finally looked out the peephole, the tiny circle showed him a warping of the hall light and a smear that almost made a human shape, until it didn't. He slept on his couch with the TV humming at him. In the morning, his front hallway rug had 2 long parallel friction burns gouged into it, each one as wide as the brace of a smile. When Eli read the last line of that entry, his lamp flickered. The bulb finally popped, the small, dramatic sound a dying star makes in miniature. The sudden dark had a gravity to it. It pulled every shadow closer. He sat very still. His monitor across the room was asleep, but its tiny LED watched him in a single, unblinking eye. He considered the overhead light, how far across the room it was, how soft his sock feet would sound on carpet, how someone living in a wall might hear. "Fine," he breathed, because the choice was between moving or letting the dark write on him like he was a page. He stood. He crossed to the switch. He pressed it. The overhead light snapped on, but it wasn't the old domestic light anymore. It had a fluorescence to it that made the room look like a grocery at 2 a.m., flat and foreign. The mirror across from the bed, cheap, tall, bought for $10 and taped to the wall at the corners, showed him upright and alive, and trying not to laugh at himself. Something wrote in the steam across the glass. There was no steam, but there it was. The lettering coming in from edges, written backward from the other side. Keep reading. Eli stared until the words faded like breath. He looked down. The notebook had turned another page without him. The ink there was wet. This wasn't metaphor. A drop had gathered at the end of a sentence and tipped just as Eli leaned forward. It fell and landed on the bottom margin and spread like a single, patient eye opening to see who had arrived. The new page didn't have a legend title. It had his dorm address. When he realized the entries were beginning to mirror his night, Eli leaned back far enough in his chair that the joints creaked. He closed his eyes. The lids burned with phantom after-images. A smile too still, a candle bending in a draft. He thought about Jay coming back in the morning and saying, "Dude, you were up late," and how intricate and sweet the lie of late would be. He told himself a thing he believed, that stories aren't instructions, they're warnings. He told himself a thing he didn't believe, that warnings are enough. He reached for the notebook. It made a tiny muscle sound under his fingers, like resisting, then yielded and held open. The page was a map. The slanted hand had drawn a rough outline of the 6th floor of his dorm, 4 doors per side, lounge at the east end, the narrow hallway with the fire door that always sticked. Beside each door, someone had written a single word: knock. At the far end, beside the lounge, a small, careful drawing, a smile. No face with it, just the mouth shape. 2 parallel lines drawn with a ruler and a shallow arc connecting them, too precise by half. "I'm done," Eli said out loud, immediately aware of how often players declare they are leaving a game only to realize the game has been leaving them in small ways for hours. He stood to close the notebook, and the hall light beyond his door came on with its drawstring buzz. He hadn't heard the click of motion sensors. The building made a sound he had never heard, an old heavy sound that was not quite electric. And then there were footsteps coming down his hall, unhurried, the way a teacher walks before asking you to show your work. Eli stepped to the door and put his eye to the peephole. Hallway fisheye, the world swollen in a way that made it all look like it had been underwater and then rescued. He saw a shadow first, a long vertical displayed across the cheap brown carpet. Knock. Not loud, gentle, persistent. Knock. Someone trying to be invited rather than admitted. "Who is it?" Eli made his voice big with casualness, and it bounced off the throat of the door and came back smaller. Silence. Then a voice behind the door that was definitely his RA, soft and constant. "Hey, building check. Sorry, late night. Can you—" Something in the voice slipped. Eli couldn't have told you what, only that it was like hearing your mother say your name without any vowels in it. "Can you open up?" the RA voice asked. Eli looked at the meter-wide strip of light at the bottom of the door. Shadows passed there like fish dragging their bellies across the bottom of a lake. He did not move. Another knock, a different cadence, a child's tempo. He saw in the bottom of the door light a small shape pause, the exact size and hunger of a hand. He stepped back. He stepped back again. The room made itself bigger by becoming less safe. The notebook laid open on the desk, and the page had shifted so that the written smile in the corner was centered in the lamplight's memory. He crossed to it like a man approached by a docile animal that had once bitten him and might again. There was new ink on the page, fresh. He watched the letters arrive. There is no other way to say it. He watched The letters arrive. The words came in a rush, like a throat clearing. If you are reading this at night, you are not alone. You are adding doors by naming them. You are granting permission simply by knowing the rules. You can't write back, he whispered, and then, because his mouth knew better than his mind, can I? He pulled a pen from his desk drawer. It shook in his fingers with the small particular violence of timing. He put the tip to the page and wrote, in his own neat student hand, "What do you want?" The reply came up underneath his words before he'd finished the last letter, the way a sheet of paper sometimes ghosts the writing from the next page. Thin twinlings of what was meant to be hidden. The letters arrived slanted and familiar, not in his hand. We like to be believed. We like to be invited. You are reading. That is enough. He pressed his pen so hard the point punctured. Ink pooled and bled. He scrawled across the rip, "No." The words sank. Pages turned behind the page he was on, a quiet flipping like a paperback in wind. They settled. The next title rose from the ripple, "The Hitchhiker Returns." He didn't want to read it, which made it more legible. It began in the margin of his desk in the damp place where he'd set his glass earlier. Footsteps again, closer. The hallway buzzed like it had swallowed a wasp. The knob did not turn, but a pressure arrived against the door. Curious, firm, then softer, as if a forehead had leaned there. Eli moved without thinking. He grabbed the lamp and held it like a weapon and found it absurd. He pulled the door open because there are moments your animal self insists on choosing the unknown over the known. The hall was crowded and empty. He saw no one. He felt all of them. The far end of the hall where the lounge glass looked out over the student lot and the geometry of cars, there, a shape had the wrong vertical. He almost named it, and then didn't. He closed the door and leaned his back against it, and the wood caved a little, the way wood does when it's learned too much. He breathed. He turned. He went back to the desk and put his hands on either side as if holding the furniture would keep the world from rolling. The notebook had shifted again. The page had his name in the middle of it now, not his full name, but the one teachers called out on the first day when they were still pretending they would learn all of you. E-L-I. Under it, "We are very close now." He lifted his pen and wrote without quite deciding to. "What happens if I stop reading?" The line beneath wrote itself in like a vein rising to a touch. "You won't." He read because there wasn't an option that did not leave teeth marks. The final entry did not pretend to be a story about someone else. It did not gather a town's gossip and serve it hot. The slanted handwriting changed, slowing, growing careful in the way of someone writing their name on a formal document. The reader is the door. The lamp is the salt. The act of turning the page is the knock. If the reader closes the book, the page turns itself. If the reader leaves the room, the book goes with him, the way a song follows you out of a store, even when you didn't think you knew the words. Eli laughed, a small, helpless sound because he had never said he would leave and the book had answered anyway. He mumbled, "Not leaving," and the radiator answered with a cough as if it were participating in the conversation. The last paragraphs were notes. They had timestamps. They said things like 3:03 a.m., mirror writing, 3:11, footsteps above ceiling, checked duct sealed, sound persists, 3:19, child's knock, 3 sequences, do not invite, 3:26, smile at end of hall, flat, do not reciprocate. They ended with a line that had been written twice, as if the writer had tried to erase the first attempt and the paper had refused. The door will open anyway. That is the nature of doors. The very last sentence was small. It was tucked into the lower right corner like it had tried to hide in the book's mouth. If you leave this here, someone will find it. He closed the notebook finally with a motion like a prayer and a threat. The covers met with a hush like a dove being strangled, and the lamplight did its best to be a circle that nothing could cross. Silence poured in, as if a dam had broken quietly, and dignity demanded no one mention it. Eli stood. He put the notebook in his backpack. He didn't know why, except that the idea of leaving it on the desk made his teeth ache. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the cheap mirror and at himself in it, at the way even in the mirror he looked like a person who had recently agreed to something by accident. He woke a little while later in a way that included no sleep. His phone said 3:33 because the world loves its own little jokes. The room had tilted to a version of itself where everything was close and slightly wrong. The mirror no longer showed his bed. It showed the hallway outside his door, an angle his mirror had never had before, as if the wall had been peeled back for an audience. In the mirror, something walked down the hall. It did not walk like a body, it walked like a thought that had been rehearsed. It had no face, it wore one. It had no eyes. It borrowed them when needed. Eli got to his feet. He picked up the backpack and slung it over his shoulder like he was late for a class the building didn't have. He opened the door. The hallway smelled like a laundromat, heat and the evaporation of strangers. The lounge light flickered at the far end, the kind of flicker that winks at you not to worry. His bare feet took him along the thin carpet. He passed the door of someone who always burned popcorn, and the door of someone who always sang falsetto in the shower, and the door of the RA, which was open an inch against the dorm's policy, like an eyebrow raised. Inside the lounge, the campus was a soft idea beyond the glass. Cars nested. A distant snowplow pretended it had work to do. The vending machine's cheerful light declared cold drinks like a gospel. Eli sat on the arm of the couch. He put the notebook on his lap. He didn't open it. The glass reflected him. A shape behind his reflection smiled in a way a face can't. The angle made the smile look like it didn't belong to anything. He didn't turn around because acknowledgement is the first of many permissions. From the vending machine, a slow domestic rattle. From down the hall, a polite knock knuckling once against wood. From the radiator, the trapped heart of the building, a small hum that sounded like a held breath. He whispered, "Okay." The smile sharpened 1 degree in the glass. He stood up. He went back to his room. He put the notebook on the desk and slid it open with both hands the way you prepare a patient. He turned to the last blank page. He wrote, "If you are reading this at night, you are not alone." He paused. He listened to his ceiling. He listened to the small footsteps above the footfalls, the ones that sound like words spoken very softly. He added, "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to stop." The remaining space filled itself the way a crowd floods a corridor when the bell rings. You did stop. The stopping is an invitation the same as anything. We are pleased with you. We will use your name when we practice. Eli rolled the pen between his fingers and found it had warmed. He wrote, a little crooked now, trying to be light. "What if I give you something else instead?" There was a pause long enough to have a weather system. Then, "We like gifts. What do you offer?" Eli swallowed. His mind had become a room he had seen in the stories, a kitchen looked at from a vent. a truck seat with a hand's fog left on the glass, a hall with a damp, tidy circle in salt. He wrote, "Take the book. Take the book and leave me with the night." Ink rose in a smile. That is not how it works. The book is not the door. The reader is. Something touched the apartment's mirror from the wrong side. The glass gave a little like skin. Eli wrote because the last act of a human is always to keep speaking. Then take me with it. The notebook closed itself, not with violence, with care. The covers met gently, and the cloth edges kissed, and the thing sat there on the desk like any other object that had been purchased once, perhaps with cash. The knock came again, once, polite and insistent. Then another, smaller, like a child following a parent. He opened the door for the last time because that was always how the stories ended. The hall was as thin and exact as paper. It bent toward him slightly, as if even architecture had an appetite. He did not see the smiling man standing beneath the exit sign with his borrowed mouth. He did not see the children this time. He did not see the barefoot girl at the far end of the corridor with her wet dress and her hands folded in her lap. He saw none of them because he stepped forward into the hinge of the moment where seeing stops. The door eased itself shut without a latch. The lamp burned until morning. When Jay returned the next afternoon, he knocked twice and rolled his eyes because Eli never answered the first knock. He let himself in, talking as always. "Bro, if you ate the rest of my—" He stopped, because the room smelled like a thunderstorm held its breath in here and then changed its mind. "E?" he called. Bathroom, empty. Closet, sadder than usual. On the desk, a cloth-bound notebook sat where the mousepad should have been. Jay reached for it because reaching is the first human verb. He turned it over and back and saw no title, only a dark mark on the front where fingers had polished it over the years. He flipped it open. The first page was a sentence in careful, unfamiliar handwriting, clean and dark. "If you are reading this at night, you are not alone." Jay snorted. "Creepy." He checked the time, 3:47 p.m. He looked at the sentence again, and because he wasn't reading it at night, he felt fine. He put the book down. He went to the kitchen shelf to check his granola situation and found it perfect. He laughed. He texted Eli and said, "Weird notebook on your desk. You going emo?" He never got an answer. That evening, in the mild hour when the building starts cooking and the light leans a little, Jay's girlfriend came over and touched the notebook and said, "This is old." And Jay said, "LARPers," and they watched something stupid and went to bed with clean teeth and slept like people who have been well loved. At 1:01 a.m., the lamplight in the room choked and recovered. The radiator clicked twice and then lay very still. The hall light came on and stayed on without a person. Jay breathed a small, involuntary adjustment in his sleep. On the desk, the notebook sighed itself open. The first page moved. It had new ink now, the small, neat line written in the corner in a hand Jay would have recognized if he were awake. He was the first, but not the last. "Keep reading and you'll see us too." The page turned. Somewhere behind it, on paper that had not yet existed earlier that afternoon, a sentence began to write itself, slanted and patient, certain of the mouth that would read it. Outside, in the glass of the dark window that made a mirror of the room, a smile hung like a sliver of moon, perfectly still, waiting for the next door to open. If you made it this far, you already know. Some stories don't end. They wait. If you're new to Campfire Horror Stories, welcome to the circle. If you've been here a while, you know the rules. Never read alone. Never turn your back to the mirror. And if a page turns by itself, don't. If this one crawled under your skin, do me a favor. Tap subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next legend that slips through after midnight. Like this video. It tells the algorithm to keep the fire burning. Comment below. Which part hit you the hardest? The hitchhiker's handprints, the man in the vents, the black-eyed knock, the candle going dark, or that smile that never moved? I'm reading every one, and your stories fuel the next tale. Share this with a friend who swears urban legends are just stories. Let's test that. I've tucked a few clues in tonight's episode for what's coming next. Watch again and see if you spot the Easter eggs, especially in the lounge window and the timestamps. Next time, we're heading somewhere you've asked for, a sleep paralysis clinic, where patients start waking with the same word written backward on the inside of their windows. Until then, keep a ring of light nearby, salt where you can reach it, and never answer a polite knock after 3 a.m. This is Campfire Horror Stories. I'll see you in the dark.